John McArthur was an extraordinary Canadian by any measure.
It's an enormous honor for me to be the first recipient, or to be any recipient for this, for a couple of reasons. I love Canada, I love Toronto, I love the kind of civic organizations that work here. But I also am particularly honored that it's John McArthur.
John McArthur is a hero back at the Harvard Business School.
He grew up in a little town in Vancouver called Burnaby. John and Natty were 8th grade sweethearts and were sweethearts ever since. He was the terror of the 12th grade. There was a character in the show Head of the Class on TV, had a leather jacket, apparently modeled on John McArthur. He went to college there and majored in forestry, and everyone decided it was a waste of his prodigious brain. So he then decided to go to business school. When John finished, he was invited to stay on as a research assistant.
John spanned an amazing period. I mean, if you think of 1968, when we had riots in the streets, the change from all male to a mixture and international, and all the ties went off, assigned seating went away. The whole culture had to adapt to the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s.
As the longest-serving dean in the history of the Harvard Business School, John's unique talent for bringing people together to solve important issues defined him as a leader and a mentor for others.
What an extraordinary legacy of leadership John had left as dean of the business school.
John himself has generated so many leaders over the decades.
What I like doing is fixing things, stirring up things and fixing things.
At Harvard, John taught generations of students about the power of partnership, and he understood something that I have always believed. The best deals leave both sides better off.
He is the father of Partners Healthcare. It was John's idea. John cut through and made us focus. He had the rigor. He was like a breath of fresh air, a gust of wind.
John also believed that business is about people. It's about relationships. It's about supporting one another. And the examples of John's enduring friendships and generosity are legendary.
Also a really warm and empathetic guy who wanted people to succeed.
My contact with him was very close, but it was virtually entirely professional. But I would put my right arm in a fire for him.
My husband was diagnosed with kidney cancer. I called John. And John called me back in 45 minutes. And he had the head of surgery at Brigham and Women's on the phone in 2.5 hours. My guess is John's done that for hundreds of people.
These stories of John McArthur reaching out and touching someone, and just in a very human way connecting with them and making them feel that they were the most important person and that he would do anything he could to help them. I have heard hundreds and hundreds of stories like this.
Different folks, whether they were black, white, young, old, professor, custodian, it didn't matter. All stopped and put a smile on their face and asked how he was doing and how much they missed him. I said to myself, well, I'm with the right guy.
Throughout John's time at Harvard Business School and later during his retirement, he stayed extremely well connected to Canada through his contributions to organizations including Telesat Canada and Bell Canada. He was also a founding board member of the Canada Development Investment Corporation and a member of the task force on the future of the Canadian financial services sector.
We're so fortunate to have had him as chair of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada for 10 years. All of us who were lucky enough to learn from him, work with him, and call him our friend were delighted when he received the Officer of the Order of Canada. John is our Canadian hero and is the best possible example of the U.S.-Canadian partnership, an amazing Canadian who left a profound impact on one of the most distinguished institutions in the world. John's Canadian values guided him in all aspects of his extraordinary life, and this distinguished fellowship is our small way to honor his lifelong commitment to excellence in everything he did.
To see John McArthur honored this way is very gratifying.
My name is Carol Lee, and I would like to welcome you to this year's John MacArthur Distinguished Fellowship event. We're so pleased that this year's fellow is Zanny Minton Beddoes, editor-in-chief of The Economist and one of the best minds in the world providing perspective on the global issues of the day. Zanny joined The Economist in 1994, serving as both business editor and economics editor before being named editor-in-chief of the newspaper in 2015, the first female editor since its founding in 1843. With a weekly readership of 1.6 million, Zanny is at the forefront of the global conversation, and John would have been delighted to have her accept this award that bears his name. John would also be very happy that Dr. Indira Samarasekera, President Emeritus of the University of Alberta, will moderate the discussion following Zanny's talk. We invite you to submit questions using Slido on your screen. Having just come from the G7 meeting in Cornwall, please welcome Zanny, who will deliver a very timely talk entitled Duelling Superpowers, Where Does It Leave the Rest of Us?
Thank you, Carol. Hello, everybody. I am delighted and unbelievably honored to receive this distinguished fellowship. And I'm just really sorry that I can't be in Canada in person to say thank you. I was never fortunate enough to meet John MacArthur, though I am one of the many beneficiaries of his leadership of Harvard Business School. When I was a graduate student at the Kennedy School, I took several classes at the buzzing business school across the river, and I'm sure they made my Harvard experience all the richer. John MacArthur clearly had an extraordinary ability to lead and to bring people together. As you just heard Michael Bloomberg say in that video, John believed the best deals leave both sides better off. In too many contexts today, that attribute seems to be in short supply, particularly in the area that I want to talk about, the relations between the United States and China. It's no exaggeration to say that this relationship will define the coming decades. When tomorrow's history books are written about the early 21st century, our era, I think, will be seen as one of several profound, simultaneous transformations. And I generally think that we are in the midst of 4 such transformations. The first is the digital revolution, the technological transformation from computers to mobile to the internet to big data and AI that is transforming and will transform our lives and economies, I think, more profoundly than the Industrial Revolution. The second great shift of the early 21st century is the climate crisis, whose effects are becoming ever more clearer and the combating of which will require a profound change from economies driven by fossil fuels to a carbon-neutral world. The third big shift is the remaking of our societies, of our social contract, the reshaping of our tax systems and our welfare systems as our economies go digital and our populations age. And the fourth, and arguably the most urgent, is the rise of China and the reshaping of the global geopolitical order that's leading to. All these 4 shifts are high stakes. They're all interlinked. The way that US-Chinese relations evolve will determine how effectively we tackle climate change. It'll influence the nature of the technological revolution, what our digital 21st century world looks like. It'll determine what kind of a global economy we have. And unfortunately, in extremis, it will determine whether we face potentially catastrophic conflict. It's also a relationship that has changed and deteriorated remarkably quickly. For much of the early 21st century, the guiding spirit of US-China relations was mutual benefit from integration. China's entry into the World Trade Organization was predicated on the idea that there would be economic gains to both sides from bringing the world's most populous country into the global trading system. Amongst more optimistic people in the West, there was also the hope that China's integration would eventually lead to greater political liberalization. Within China, the focus was on improving living standards, on harnessing global trade to reduce poverty and hasten development. I remember when I visited China as a journalist in the mid-2000s, 2006, 2007, 2008, being struck not just by the phenomenal pace of growth, but the ostentatious modesty of Chinese policymakers. China might be big and growing quickly, they would make clear, but it was a developing country with big challenges, much to learn, and a long way to go. That world, a world in which there was talk of mutual gain and the benefits of integration, is no more. China is now unabashed about its own rise and the decline of the West. In 2017, Xi Jinping made clear that China was, quote, moving to the global center stage. Now he says, quote, the East is rising and the West is declining. He said recently, quote, the United States is the biggest threat to our country's development and security. In American eyes, China has gone from being a partner who it hoped would become a responsible stakeholder in the global trading system to a strategic and systemic rival. President Biden said at the G7 summit this week that America was in a contest with autocratic governments around the world as to whether or not democracies can compete with them in the 21st century, in the changing 21st century. So the first question has to be, what happened? Because key to analyzing where the US-China relationship is going is how it got here. How did things deteriorate so quickly? And let's start with what happened in China. I think the turning point, or a turning point, was the 2008 financial crisis. It bolstered China's role. It was China's huge stimulus, remember, that propped up the global economy in 2010. And it also dramatically dented American economic credibility and the reputation of the Western market model in the eyes of many in the emerging world. If the home of red-blooded capitalism could mess up so badly, perhaps the market economy wasn't so great. But more important was the arrival of Xi Jinping as China's leader. He aggressively asserted control over the Communist Party, and he strengthened party control over the economy and society. And he has skillfully used a populist nationalist narrative, appealing to China's rightful pride in their achievements and China's return to greatness as a rationale for this strengthening of authoritarianism. He has fused China's economic success with Communist Party control in an increasingly anti-Western ideology. In this narrative, the Western values of liberal democracy are not just ineffective and flabby, they are a cynical ploy to keep China down. I think the third element is the nature of the tech revolution we're currently in. Not only did China realize that leadership in critical technologies from quantum computing to AI would accelerate its economic progress, it has also become clear that they would reinforce the authoritarian system, provided they were tightly controlled. With ubiquitous digital surveillance, censorship, and AI-driven monitoring, China is creating the beginnings of a panopticon state, using digital technology as a mechanism for social control. And many of these are winner-takes-all technologies. Whoever controls 5G shapes the future of the digital revolution. AI brings classic network effects. The more data you have, the more effective your algorithms. China has tons of data, a digitally savvy population of over 1 billion people, and scant concern for privacy. And all of this behind its great firewall. It's not just catching up, but it is leading and shaping many of the tech innovations of the 21st century. And it is reinforcing authoritarian control at the same time. If we turn to the US, we see an equally abrupt change in the consensus view of China in the middle of the last decade, say between 2014 and 2016, for many similar reasons. In the aftermath of the financial crisis, popular opinion turned against trade and globalization. Trade, especially trade with China, was seen as responsible for the hollowing out of the American middle class. It led to a populist backlash and anti-trade backlash on both sides of the political aisle. At the same time, big business grew disillusioned with what it saw as Chinese stealing of secrets, ignoring the rules of the WTO. Military types had rising concerns about China's aggressive nationalistic moves, especially the expansion of man-made militarized islands in the South China Sea. So remarkably quickly, the mood in the US went from seeing China as a partner to a strategic competitor. And all this means that I think whoever had won the 2016 election, American policy would have changed. But the fact that it changed so dramatically was thanks to Donald Trump's wrecking ball approach. He launched a trade war, a barrage of sanctions from Huawei to TikTok. American policy became unpredictable, punitive, and arbitrary. Mr. Trump had no respect for the multilateral system, which the US had created and pledged to uphold. He cared little about human rights and told President Xi as much. His view was simply that America needed a better deal. And at last, America had a president who was as cynical as many Chinese had always thought the Americans might be. A president who lashed out with no respect for the rules. This reinforced the growing sense in China that America is just a sore loser, simply trying to keep China down. And it also reinforced President Xi's agenda for pushing for primacy in high technology, Because if China couldn't rely on a globalized integrated system, if it was going to risk being a victim to sudden arbitrary American sanctions, it needed to produce cutting-edge technology from chips to AI itself. So the result, remarkably quickly, is a situation where neither side trusts the other. Worse, as my colleague David Rennie, who's our bureau chief in Beijing, has put it, it's a situation where there is no common definition of success. America's best case is that China stumbles and becomes less arrogant. China's best case is that America realizes it's lost its top dog status and stops resisting China's rise. There's no commonality between those views. The pandemic has dramatically worsened the finger-pointing. In China, it reinforced the ideas that democracies were failing. Chinese were genuinely shocked by America's inability to control the pandemic. And in America, and indeed in other countries in the West, it reinforced an ugly anti-Chinese sentiment. The Biden administration has lowered the temperature. Gone, I think, is the arbitrary, unpredictable behavior. Instead, this administration is in the midst of a methodical, comprehensive review of China policy. There's been a clearer focus on human rights, blunter criticism of and sanctions on China's behavior in Xinjiang. But broadly, as Mr. Biden has said, quote, I'm not looking for conflict. But at the same time, the underlying American position, I think, is the same. There's been no change on tariffs, no dismantling of the broader regime of sanctions and controls. And more fundamentally, the Biden team share the mistrust and skepticism of China that the Trump hawks had. The underlying philosophy of the Biden administration's trade policy, especially its Buy America stance, frankly, is not all that different from America First. It just uses nicer words and is less unpredictable. The focus is on the American worker at home, not on the global trading system. All of which means, I think, that we are in a grim world of dueling superpowers. It's become fashionable, I'm sure you've all heard it, to talk of the Thucydides trap, a term popularized by Graham Allison at Harvard, to describe the tendency towards conflict when an emerging power displaces an existing great power. Thucydides, the Athenian military general and historian who wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War, observed, quote, that it was the rise of Athens and the fear this instilled in Sparta that made war inevitable. It's now become common to ask whether the rise of China makes conflict, military conflict, with America inevitable. It's become even more common to talk about a new Cold War, as if the ideological rivalry between China and the US somehow mirrors that of the US and the Soviet Union. People talk about an economic iron curtain across the globe as Western supply chains and technology systems decouple from China's state-dominated ones. We're also seeing increasingly ugly consequences from the deteriorating relationship. There's growing anti-Chinese sentiment in America and other countries, including Canada. For its part, China uses heavy-handed bullying, from its wolf warrior diplomacy to consumer boycotts and punitive tariffs on countries, organizations, and individuals that criticize China or don't fall into line. As you all know painfully, other countries get stuck in the middle. The shocking detention of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor is a horrific reminder of the price that two Canadians are paying for the deterioration in the US-China relationship, and for China's conviction that Canada was doing America's bidding and must pay a price for it. Ultimately, though, it's clear that even if the costs of this deterioration are huge, they are likely to get even bigger. That's because this worsening relationship will gradually unpick the fabric of globalization. If you just take this popular analogy of a new Cold War, it is hugely misleading. Because the Soviet Union was America's ideological rival, but it was not a commercial rival. Trade flows between America and the USSR were tiny. The Soviet Union was barely attached to the global trading system. China, by contrast, is the world's second biggest economy and a behemoth of global trade. It makes some 22% of global manufacturing exports. It's integrated into literally thousands of supply chains around the world. Breaking these supply chains would come at an exorbitant price. It really would undo globalization as we know it. It would remove the potential for prosperity that being part of the global trading system has brought across the emerging world. Worse, if the world did split in this way, if it did decouple in this way, it's not actually clear how much of it would be on the Western side. Consider this. China is the largest goods trading partner of some 64 countries. America is the largest goods trading partner of some 38 countries. China's Belt and Road Initiative is a concerted effort to draw emerging economies into the Chinese orbit through infrastructure financing. China is a huge market, a huge part of the supply chain, and increasingly a huge source of technology. Some 170 countries use Huawei products. Only a dozen or so have banned it, as the US has been pushing. China isn't winning the battle for hearts and minds in much of the developing world. Its bullying diplomacy is aggressive. It sometimes uses debt aggressively as a weapon. And many developing countries are wary, especially in the backyard of Southeast Asia. They're desperate not to be forced to choose between the two superpowers. But if they are forced to choose, if they were to be forced to choose, it's not clear to me that they would side with Western democracies. But if this decoupling is costly at best, catastrophic at worst, how can it be avoided? How should dueling superpowers, each other's biggest strategic and economic rival, with profoundly different values and ideologies, with zero trust in each other, and yet huge trading partners, and between them pillars of the global economy, how should they deal with each other? The honest answer, the genuinely honest answer, is that nobody knows. This has never been done before. There is no historical precedent for where this relationship has to go. At a superficial level, the answer is clear. You need a comprehensive strategic approach, one that enables cooperation where it's needed, whether that's on pandemics or global warming, that fences off areas of strategic competition, such as cutting-edge technology, and that allows for differences over values, such as human rights, to be voiced, and that has clear rules of behavior. There's now a whole cottage industry in scholarly articles laying out the contours of such a strategic relationship. It's one of those things, though, that is easy to say, put the relationship into different buckets. But it's really hard to work out how to do this, and even harder if you look at how the world is actually evolving. And at the risk of turning some fairly gloomy remarks into something even gloomier, let me give you a few, let's say 5 reasons why. First, China's recent direction. Greater authoritarianism, greater assertiveness, continued economic success. That combination is likely to continue. This year, on July 1st, the Communist Party celebrates its centenary. That is a huge anniversary in China. And the party is as strong as it has ever been. Party rule is ever stronger in private companies, and it's ever more effectively fused with a nationalist appeal and technological prowess in a powerful combination. Now, I'm enough of a liberal to believe that a repressive regime can't last forever, and that increasingly heavy-handed approaches in China will eventually cause problems. But there's really no sign of it yet. Equally, President Xi has created an economy that combines market forces and Communist Party oversight, carefully managed openness in some areas. The financial sector is the latest that is gradually being opened up. A vibrant tech sector, but coupled with total control over data and technology. And that combination is proving immensely successful. China's economic outlook is strong. And in technology and data flows, the decoupling is growing because China is pushing it. Second, I also think that the US trajectory looks like it's going to be more of the same. The Biden administration has more experienced diplomats and a less aggressive veneer than the Trump administration. But bashing China is a constant backdrop to American politics, as both parties try to out-hawk the other. The Republicans now clearly see China as a cudgel with which to beat the Democrats. The competition for the moment and for the foreseeable future is to which side can be tougher on China. Third, even if you didn't have toxic politics in the United States, the practicalities of trying to manage a relationship with different issues in different buckets is really hard. Let me just give you a couple of examples. Consider climate, an area where everyone knows that progress depends on China and the United States working together. Well, the rhetoric there is pretty good. President Biden has made climate change a priority. President Xi, just in the past few months, has promised that China's CO2 emissions will peak by 2030 and it will be carbon neutral by 2060. But the most efficient way to get there would be global supply chains. And China is the biggest and cheapest producer of many of the elements in renewable energy supply chains. Unfortunately, almost half of the world's supply of polysilicon, which is a key input into solar panels, is produced in Xinjiang. Climate crashes into human rights. One bucket crashes into another. A more structural problem is that President Biden is selling climate selling environmental policy in the US as a national security and domestic jobs plan. America, he argues, needs to build solar and renewable power to create American jobs for American workers so that China doesn't control them. Now, that may be a useful political strategy to getting policies through in the US, but it's not clear that it makes cooperation with China on climate any easier. Similarly, the very nature of the technological revolution is going to make it harder to split the relationship between the US and China into buckets. That's because ever more of the economy fits into the tech bucket. Increasingly, as computing power and big data become ever more ubiquitous, ever more goods, washing machine, fridges, milk cartons will be fixed with sensors and joined to a big Internet of Things. Look at cars. They are already really a powerful computer on wheels. In this world, buying goods means buying a stream of digital services from those who make them. It makes them vulnerable to cyber attack. It's hard to buy those goods from a country you fundamentally don't trust. Fourth, we tend to underestimate what the scale of what would be needed to underpin a global system built around two superpowers that have no trust. All of the machinery we currently have, the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, the American-created machinery of the post-war order, lacks credibility and are out of date for this task. Consider just simply all of the new areas where agreements and standards are needed, cybersecurity to space, data flows to bioethics. We need to build a huge new architecture, and we need to build it with two central players who have no trust for each other. And finally, the West is not really a monolith. There are genuine disagreements among liberal democracies about the right approach. Germany, with a huge export market in China, is much less keen to take tough positions on human rights, as last week's G7 summit attests. Europe considers itself a standard setter on data and tech regulation, but it often seems as worried about America's tech giants as about China. A divided West is clearly less likely to succeed, but these differences are genuine. So the challenges to coming up with a strategic relationship between the two superpowers are serious. We should be clear-eyed about what it will take to develop it. But that doesn't mean it's impossible. And so I want to end by pointing to some glimmers of optimism. First, we really are seeing remarkable innovation in global geopolitical architecture, as more flexible groups are emerging in different areas. The Quad, an informal military cooperation between the US, India, Australia, and Japan, is showing promise. Japan resuscitated the Trans-Pacific Partnership after President Trump pulled America out, now renamed the CPTPP. Trade deals always have incomprehensible acronyms. This new trade deal has significant potential. And there also does seem to be a growing sense of urgency. Though the G7 didn't deliver much relative to the soaring rhetoric of liberal democracies taking on autocracies, it did show signs of progress. Some glimmer of a global agreement on corporate tax. It's possible that the Build Back Better world, which the G7 announced as its counterpart to the Belt and Road Initiative, will actually end up yielding something. America is the indispensable nation for Western leadership, but that doesn't mean the rest of us don't have any role or responsibility. Just as Britain played a big part in building the Bretton Woods system after World War II, so countries other than America and China can shape this 21st century world. And perhaps that's where our politicians need to be infused with the approaches that John McArthur stood for. He clearly would not have given up. He would reject the idea that smaller countries had no agency in this duel with superpowers. He would try to bring people together. In the video that you watched earlier, you heard John say, "What I like doing is fixing things." That is a message that dueling superpowers and our own politicians would do well to hear. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zanny. Well, first of all, let me warmly welcome you to Canada, albeit virtually. I look forward to meeting you. And your comments were just remarkable. Clear-eyed, provocative, insightful, inspiring, all of the above. Let me just start off with a question, that flows from what you've said. The notion of the need for a strategic vision. And so we had the G7 meeting. Do you think enough progress was made to advance the democracy's agenda, the liberal agenda? And what do you think the next steps should be?
So I think the short answer is no. And I think that the good news is that the aspirations were laid out, that America is clearly back, that the US was playing a leadership role, was playing a constructive role, and actually came with some big ambitions. I mean, it was very much President Biden that came with this idea of the democracies of the world, standing up to the autocracies. What worries me is that in specific areas which are urgent, so little concrete was achieved. So the pandemic, they made a big thing about 1 billion new doses of vaccine. We need 11 billion, as the WHO has told us.
Right.
And the other is the area of the Build Back Better. They make this big announcement, we're going to create the B3W, the Build Back Better world, but there was no new money, no detail.
Right.
And I think there's a kind of credibility issue here. The West has lost a ton of credibility. It needs, and the US in particular. And if you have such a gap between soaring rhetoric and kind of small bore stuff, that's a real problem. So I think it was a step forward, but it was a small step forward at a time when we need big steps forward.
Thanks, Zanny. We've got a number of people, I think, who want to ask questions. So let me turn to Alexandra Wilkinson from Deloitte, who sponsored this program, to ask the next question.
Hello, congratulations on the fellowship, and thank you so much for the insightful talk. So the discussion today is, of course, focused on the United States and China as dueling superpowers. But to pick up on the first question, I wonder if you could speak further to your thinking about the role for mid-sized democracies or middle powers like Canada in relation to this international dynamic.
It's a really good question, and I sort of tried to allude to it at the end just now of my remarks. But I think that I think if we're being realistic, and I'm also from a mid-sized power, we are second-order players in this. I mean, there are two big protagonists in this game, but that doesn't mean we are impotent, and it doesn't mean that we can't help shape the agenda, that we can't help working with the United States, pushing in certain areas. We can't play a actually sort of disproportionately important role. And let me give you one example of what the UK has done, where I think after Brexit, many people thought, particularly in China, thought that the UK would come kind of running towards China because the UK no longer was part of the European Union. It desperately needed friends. And actually, if you look at how the British government in the last year has reacted over Hong Kong, offering, British citizenship and British passports to the eligible Hong Kong diaspora, much more generous than people were expecting, and much tougher in some ways. I think we can, take a stand, but the bigger picture is that to set standards, to really make progress, the West needs to work together, and we do therefore need to work with with the Americans. Doesn't mean you have to be in lockstep on every single thing, which is why I think the German within Europe, and I'm always worried about the lack of cohesiveness within Europe, but I'm particularly worried about the distance between where Germany is and where the United States is in thinking about what a sort of coordinated, coherent architectural approach would be towards working with and dealing with China.
Thank you, Zanny. So just a quick follow-up. I mean, the role of the middle powers obviously is of great interest to us. And you said that we have to find a way to work together. And of course, being close to the United States, how do we, Canada, that has so many commercial relationships with China, how do we manage our relationship with the United States around some of the issues you identified while working with China? I mean, what do you see the approach, particularly around human rights, which, as you know, is a concern?
So, I mean, I think there are some big picture principles on which, if the West is divided, this won't work. And so one is, where is the sort of broad, if I'm right, that we will end up with a relationship, however difficult, where the different areas are divided into different buckets. So there's an area where we try to cooperate with the Chinese. There's an area which is sort of where we have new trade rules, where some things are more delinked than others. And then there is the third area, which is our values on human rights. Now, I feel very strongly that if the West kind of gives up on saying anything about human rights, then we lose something that is fundamental to our democratic values.
Right.
But I'm enough of a realist to also think that you can't hold an entire relationship between these two behemoths hostage to that. So you do have to work out ways to make your values clear, to make clear what you will and will not condone, to criticize, to be vocal, to be public. But at the same time, the US and China and the West and China and Canada and China have to deal with each other. And it's naive to think, and not only naive, I think it is genuinely naive to think that we can sort of somehow decouple our economies. And I tried to give a sense of that in my talk. It's just, this is bandied around, this, you'll have a global decoupling. It would be catastrophic. And at the moment, the country that is pushing for that more than anyone is actually China. China is sealing off its data and its high-tech areas. And we will all be the poorer for it.
Yeah. Thank you, Zanny. Next question is from our former Governor General, the Right Honorable David Johnston. David.
Zanny, congratulations on a magisterial address, just what we expect from you, and such a delight to hear. I guess I'm looking at 175 years plus noble tradition of the Economist promoting the values of liberal democracies. And we look at today, your intelligence unit says that only 8.4% of the world's population live in functional democracies. Edelman Trust, that has been measuring trust in government, non-governmental organizations, business, and media, has declined over those 20 years. In fact, Canada and UK now fit in distruster nations, where we're a little bit below 50%. And on the theory that minds like parachutes work best when open, would you give us some insight on what you and your colleagues in your editorial board think about in redefining the role of your magazine in this challenging digital revolution, with everyone being their own publisher and so many different voices, with so many voices that are really very shallow and in many cases absolutely distrustful and deceitful. And focus, if you would, on the two superpowers, the United States, where this is a challenge of the role of the media in truth, and in China, of course, where if you measured trust by citizens, they would have much more trust in their media than they would in the jurisdictions we know.
Absolutely.
But also the notion of what is the role of media in trying to find its way through this digital revolution and use it to, in fact, enhance those parachutes and open minds rather than closing them more completely.
Thank you. You make a number of really interesting points, and there's a lot of really interesting questions wrapped in that. Let me sort of tackle two of them and then tell me if I haven't answered all of them. One is the role of the media in this, in democracies right now, where I completely agree with you. I think one of the problems, and the United States is sort of ground zero for this, but it's the same in other countries too. It is not just that there is a polarized environment. It is so polarized that people have retreated into their own spaces and no longer believe the same set of facts. I mean, I am stunned when I go to the United States, and I haven't been now for more than a year, but if you turn on MSNBC in the morning and Fox News in the evening, you think you're in a separate country, because they are literally not the same facts being discussed. When you cannot agree on facts, then I think you have a real problem for the rational debate that is at the basis of liberal democracy. So kind of one thing is, what can you do to fix that? And I think it's a very tall order. It's not just social media, but social media reinforces it because of the viral nature of sending people down sort of ever more extreme content down the rabbit holes. I think the mainstream media also plays a role. If you look in the Brexit debate in the UK, the mainstream media, the populist tabloid media, played a very big role. Where I think we in our kind of small way try to play a role is by being rigorous and authoritative and sort of fact-based, so that even if you disagree with our views, even if you are, President Xi Jinping, who disagrees, I'm sure, with much of our world values, you can trust and agree on the fact base. So we're rigorous, and rigor and authority is really important. Beyond that, what are we trying to do at The Economist? Well, it's you're right. The world has fundamentally changed. When I started this job in 2015, Britain was in the EU, President Trump hadn't been elected, and broadly the kind of the sort of free market, open, globalized world that The Economist had stood for was sort of essentially still the conventional view. And we were very much part of the establishment view, for good or ill. I now feel that we are forced to kind of sort of restate the arguments in a new context, make the case, and make it at a time when much of the world is moving in a different direction. So both the stakes are higher, but it's sort of invigorating in the sense that we are it's sort of having to champion and having to make the case in a very different 21st century context for the values that we stand for. And liberalism, as you know, is not a sort of static creed. Its specificities evolve, but underpinning it is a belief in rational discourse, a belief in argument, a concern about concentrated power, a belief in free and open societies. And it's more and more important than ever that we make that case. So I am as sort of adamant and convinced that those values are the right ones. But when I look around the world, the kind of the challenge in making that case is growing ever greater.
Thank you, Zanny. The next question is from Goldie Hyder, who is the President and CEO of Business Council of Canada. Goldie?
Thank you so much. Zanny, congratulations on the fellowship, and thank you for what was a tour de force remarks. I wish we had more time. Larry Summers described COVID as a hinge moment, suggesting that while COVID was taking place, something else was going on in Asia. And some believe three significant events happened last year: COVID, the election of President Biden, but the third one that garnered very little attention, certainly here, is the signing of the RCEP agreement, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership that brings together a third of the world's GDP into a trade agreement. Context for Canada, of course, is we have put an emphasis on trade diversification, and all eyes are on the Indo-Pacific as the place where we need to diversify. And so the question is, how can the United States have influence in that part of the world if it chooses to not participate in trade infrastructure and the architecture of the TPP and beyond? And yes, they have Quad, but Quad is hardly a trade agreement. So I wonder how we can square that circle.
So I think the simple answer is that the US is much less impactful if it is not part of that. And actually, going back to one of the earlier questions, one of the important roles that Canada could play would be to nudge and try and convince the Biden administration to re-enter, which I think is actually not a lost cause. I mean, I do think the sort of basic philosophy of the Biden administration isn't a million miles away from America First. I mean, soft protectionism is maybe slightly harsh, but not too harsh. It's very much a view predicated on the fact that you need domestic supply chains and domestically produced stuff. It's not a sort of naturally free trade view. But I actually think that is potentially compatible with being part of the new CPTPP. And I think Canada could play a very important role there. And President Biden is really just getting going on this sort of larger definition of his 21st century competition between showing that democracies can work in this world and work better than autocracies. And I think it is actually quite an effective way you could harness that rhetoric and say, but the way to put that into practice is to integrate economies. It is to have diversified supply chains. It is the way to get there is through broader trade deals. So I think you're right. If the US doesn't become part of it, it's much, much less effective. But the US may be less so there must be less antipathy to that than you might think on the surface. So on a sort of over the next several years, that would be something that I think is sort of worth pursuing. And I was heartened by the role that Japan and Canada too have played in ensuring that the US simply abandoning things in 2016 didn't result in sort of complete stasis. And so keep that sentiment going. And that's an area where mid-sized countries can really achieve a lot, I think.
Thank you, Zanny. I just have a follow-up question. I mean, clearly the trade deal that currently the US has, the phase one deal with China, very difficult bilateral framework with tariffs and sanctions, which has had a fallout. And it doesn't seem to be really the approach to solving the real issues, which is cybersecurity, technological issues around intellectual property and so on. And so and given the polarization in the U.S., Biden doesn't seem to be showing signs that he's moving away from that approach that was very much a Trump approach. If you were giving advice to them, what would you say would help us to move in the direction that you're suggesting?
So I agree with you. I mean, my advice would be I wouldn't have started here. I thought that the Trump deal, for all the reasons you laid out, was a move in the wrong direction. But my sense is that you're right, that the Biden administration is not going to move away from that. That actually that is going to be the sort of building block of whatever their strategy is towards China. I think it is much more likely that we have movement on trade in other parts of the world and with other partners, and possibly with other partners in Southeast Asia. I think that's it may be a long shot because trade is still a toxic word on the Hill, but that is a more plausible one than a dramatic change between the US and China. And the reason is, and as I sort of alluded to in my remarks, the domestic sort of political pressure in both parties is who can be tougher on China. And so it is sort of politically impossible for them to suddenly say, we're going to lift all this stuff, we're going to get rid of the tariffs. They would be domestically attacked. And so the logic is, unfortunately, one of real toughness versus China.
Yeah, thank you. We have about 15 minutes left. I know there's a lot of questions from the audience, so let me move to one of the audience questions. I mean, clearly, we're going to have a real challenge solving the sort of competitiveness issues around trade. But as you pointed out in your remarks, climate change is going to require all of our efforts to make a difference. And the question is from Ann Giardini. She says, it's the one issue where we can do this, and is it possible? Do you think we're going to be able to cooperate?
So it's a really good question, and I think it is possible, because I think that in China, climate change is seen as a domestic priority. China will be hit very hard by climate change. It's got a lot of arid areas. Water supply is already a problem. Agriculture is a problem. So there is a growing sense, and there's also a growing sense that an increasingly affluent Chinese population cares about the environment and cares about the world around it. So I think that although the scale is huge, China since 2018 has created more new coal-fired plants than the entire US coal-fired industry. So it's still going in the wrong direction. But I think that the curve will bend there. And in the United States, I'm crossing all fingers and toes that the move towards really accepting the urgency of climate change is real. I'm still not convinced that it's going to happen at the federal level as much or as fast as we hope for. I mean, if you look at what's happening now on Capitol Hill, it's perfectly possible that an infrastructure bill will be signed that has virtually nothing about the climate in it. So yes, corporate America is focused. Yes, some of the states are focused. But the Republican Party is still largely a climate denying party. And control of Congress may change next year. So I think we have to be sort of clear-eyed about where the US is. But if the US is genuinely pushing in the direction that I hope we see, then I think you can see progress there. And certainly both presidents will be pushing at the COP, because both will want to get diplomatic capital for this. But what worries me are the sort of, as I said in my remarks, the once you get to the details and you find out that much of the supply chain for renewable energies is from Xinjiang, well, suddenly you have two priorities clashing. Or if you dress up the whole push towards a greener America, which President Biden is doing, as a national security issue, sort of to protect and insulate the US against the risk from China, well, that's going to make cooperation harder, because you're sort of dressing it up in national security clothes. So it's probably one of the areas where if we can't get cooperation there, then things are even grimmer than I think. But it's going to be harder than people think.
Yeah. Very interesting observations. I mean, it was interesting that Biden has posed it as an existential threat, and maybe that's the angle with which we have to approach it. Let me switch topics again, because I have to ask you this question. Taiwan. Your Economist cover totally captured, I think, a concern that everyone shares. The most dangerous place on earth. the supremacy in chips, advanced manufacturing on the one hand, and the issue of Taiwan's sovereignty, China's view, America's view. How do you see this unfold? What's your worry?
Well, I mean, it's interesting that that cover came because I had been discussing with my colleagues in Beijing, our Beijing bureau chief, and some of our colleagues and my tech-focused colleagues, and it struck me that this was a sort of a really underappreciated risk, and that was the sort of genesis for writing that piece and having that on the cover. The reaction to it in Taiwan in particular was very telling, where it was hugely controversial and widely criticized as being utterly alarmist and completely wrong. And Taiwan is a prosperous, peaceful place, and what on earth is the Economist talking about? And that sort of dissonance between what struck me as being the logic of what I was hearing about what was going on in China and the United States over Taiwan, and the sense of insouciance and everything's fine in Taiwan itself. And indeed, the rest of the world, the Taiwan, if you look at financial flows into Taiwan, everything looks great. So there is a disconnect there. And, disconnects can be fine for a year, for 2 years, for 3 years. And we weren't predicting, imminent kind of conflict, but we were saying that, there was ineluctable problems and, a really, really difficult trajectory that looked to us as though at some point, whenever President Xi Jinping thinks that, taking Taiwan forcibly or otherwise is in his interests, it's, militarily increasingly possible to do that. And clearly the sort of for decades, we've had this relationship where, a form of words has sort of papered over deep, deep divisions. But it's not just Taiwan, it's also what Taiwan stands for. Taiwan is the sort of exemplar of US, US control, sort of power in the Pacific region. China sees that as its backyard. It's I think a really, really dangerous part of the world. But many people don't see that and don't see it yet.
Thank you, Zanny. In your remarks, you mentioned a real issue, and that is the anti-Asian sentiment that's spreading. I mean, clearly, the Chinese Communist Party's issues that the liberal world has should not be, automatically then therefore seen as the Chinese people, because it's obviously a very complex society. Any advice to all of us who are listening and watching, and how do we deal with this? Because this is a very serious issue in terms of building relationships in the long term with China.
It's really serious, and it's it's one of the things that worries me perhaps more than all the other things that have worried me. And I'm not genuinely as downbeat as this conversation suggests I am, but I do worry about this relationship. The fact that fewer Chinese students are now coming to the US, the fact that there is less of an integration of and exchange of views and people, the fact that these stereotypes on both sides are hardening. I mean, because you're right, there's an ugly, almost racist anti-Chinese sentiment in countries in the West, but there is also a growing anger and anti-Western sentiment in China. I mean, the sort of, the kind of social media bullying of companies that are seen to be stepping out of line and so forth. It's really, really deeply depressing, and it makes everything so much harder, because once you whip up nationalism, and once it's sort of there, it's very, very hard to put that genie back in the bottle. And that's perhaps of the various things that have evolved in the last couple of years, this sense of dueling nationalisms and antipathy is very, very problematic to me. And I think that you start getting kind of emotion and stereotyping and unwillingness to kind of listen and work together, and that becomes really quite dangerous. So what do you do? I mean, I think it's madness not to allow Chinese students in. I think we should be fostering integration. We should be fostering, yes, of course you have to be careful of, very, very sort of specific high-tech areas, but I think the US has been unbelievably clumsy in the kind of way it's sort of targeted universities. So if we start having a splinter net in education and a splinter net of people, we're in real trouble.
Yeah, yeah.
And actually,
absolutely.
the pandemic, sorry, just one thing to add. One thing that worries me is that one consequence of COVID could be more of this than we expect. Right now, it's very, very hard to get to China, as you all, I'm sure you know. If you get a visa, you have to be in a quarantine for 3 weeks in a government hotel somewhere, and it's very, very hard to get a visa. And very few Chinese have left the country, and so we've had a sort of forcible separation, which, if it continues for a long time, and what worries me is that it might continue for a long time, it just reinforces this.
Yeah. Thank you, Zanny. My last question, I mean, this has gone so fast. We have so many more questions we could ask, but last question. If President Xi Jinping was listening, what advice would you give him?
Oh, I wouldn't presume to give him advice. I really wouldn't presume to give Xi Jinping. I mean, I would not presume to give President Xi Jinping advice, but I would give the same. It's not advice, but I would hope that both President Biden and President Xi Jinping, would see the historical responsibility they both have to ensure that these two superpowers find a way to coexist. And on both sides, ensuring, as John McArthur would have said, that there is a deal from which both sides can win. Because they are too big, each of them, to be able to kind of keep the other down. And so this sort of zero-sum mentality is a really dangerous one. And so whipping up anti-Western ideological sort of anger, as President Xi has been doing in some of his statements, is, I think, not at all helpful. And similarly, American politicians doing the same thing is not terribly helpful. I think framing this as a sort of existential struggle, whilst probably true at some level, is incredibly unhelpful for finding a way for these two countries to coexist, and ideally coexist in a way that preserves as much of our integrated world as is feasible.
Thank you, Zanny. Thank you very much for a very enjoyable exchange. And congratulations again on your MacArthur Fellowship. John would have been just absolutely thrilled that you're receiving this.